Sounds great.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Poliglotar 2022 in Recife. And this is our first talk in the afternoon of Sunday. And we have here for the second time, David Allen, the second. And he is now in the United States, and we'll speak how we can profit from online tutors better, right?
That's correct, yes.
But David, before, let me put the interpreters in the booths.
Okay.
So if you could tell me who is going to interpret here, is it Rafael?
Hey, Julian. Yeah, that's me
Oh,
for English, Portuguese.
Is it only you or someone else?
I don't know. I think it's just me.
Okay, do it. Okay, David, please. David Allen Martin II.
Yes, sir. Okay, well, thank you. So before I get started, I'd just like to say a very special thank you to Giuliano and the entire Poliglotar team for putting everything together, and of course for having me a second time. I really appreciate it, and I've been very much looking forward to this. Yeah, for those of you who don't know me, my name is David Allen Martin II. As Giuliano just said, I'm from San Diego, California, currently in Oceanside. And well, I've lived in Germany for about the past 14 years. I lived in Spain for 2 years and China for 1. And my job is helping people to learn languages more effectively and efficiently. And so today I'm going to be talking about making the most of your sessions with online tutors, specifically with an emphasis on speaking better, how we can utilize the time that we have with our tutors to speak better. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully that has already been allowed.
Yes.
Beautiful. Thank you, Giuliano. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Can everybody see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, I'd like to start out with a question and ask you, if you had 1 class per week with a tutor, whether online or offline, what would you use the time with your tutor for? And the reason why I ask this question is because this is actually a very, very typical situation. I have many students who only have 1 class per week with me. And obviously this is going to be reasonably little time. So what do we do in that case? How can we maximize the benefit that we get from this time? As I said, I've worked with many hundreds of students over many years, teaching multiple languages, and most students come to class with the goal of speaking better, but actually end up spending very little time or relatively little time focusing on speaking, and the time that they do spend tends to be focused in what I would say the wrong places in terms of really truly promoting fluency, right? Which is what students generally want to do. So what is the kind of root, the core of the problem? The problem is that most students come to class and they're quite passive in terms of how they work with the tutor. They don't necessarily even tell the tutor what the expectations are, what their expectations are, except for I want to get better, right? Which is very, very vague. So what do they generally not do? Well, they generally wait for their tutor to tell them what to do, so they don't set their own goals. Goal setting is incredibly important. They generally don't have a systematic approach to practicing speaking, and especially using new language. And they also, as I said, they don't really have any clear expectations. But one of the biggest problems is this over focus on grammar. Now, different people have different expectations and different ways of thinking about let's just say the importance of grammar in a classroom setting, in a speaking situation. But the fact of the matter is, most of the time when we think too much about grammar, when we think overtly about grammar, then we tend to lock up. So how can we kind of get around this problem is the core question here. So one of the most important things is the activation of vocabulary. You may or may not have heard this term before. All that activating vocabulary means is actively using new vocabulary. So you're going out of your way, as we say, that is to say, you're taking extra effort, you're putting in extra effort in order to use new vocabulary. If we don't make this a core goal, then we're most likely not going to do it. And I've witnessed time and time again where students come in, They expect the tutor, because I also tutor tutors, they expect the tutor to help them to elicit new vocabulary. And if the tutor's not on the ball, or if they haven't necessarily planned it, or if they don't know what the student's focus is, then they're not going to actually be able to do that. And the student's going to stagnate, right? They're going to hit a plateau in terms of their language skills. Okay, so as I said already, one of the things that we first need to do is stop focusing so much on grammar rules, especially as far as memorizing them is concerned. Now, there are so many videos out there, as I'm sure you all know, about just about any grammatical topic for just about any speaker of any language. So if you are a Portuguese native speaker and you want to learn English, and you're having difficulty with the difference between the simple past and the present perfect, for example, I guarantee you there are lots and lots of great explanations out there, not just in textual format, but also videos. So the question is it really worth your time to spend the time that you have with a tutor in a class, especially if it's only one class per week, going over these explanations and trying to understand these rules in an overt way, that is to say, to memorize them and to do exercises and things? I would say no. I would say that it makes more sense to practice real language using those forms. So you have this native, not necessarily a native conversational partner, your tutor, but generally most people go out of their way to look for a native tutor. You have this limited time. Why would you spend it trying to get explanations that you could find elsewhere? Okay, so my solution, what I propose, is that first of all, we set goals. We need to set communication goals. And I'll get into exactly what I mean by that in just a moment. And after we have communication goals, we're going to focus less on grammar, overt grammar, as I said, and more on actually using new language. And there's going to be two ways we can do that. One of them is by using what I call scripts. I'll also explain that to you in a moment. And the other one is what is the more typical way, that is speaking freely. And I'm going to try to convince you that speaking freely is not a good idea, or rather it's something that we should do less until we're at a more advanced level. Okay, and then the last thing is that most people don't necessarily talk to their tutor about the correction of mistakes. And as I have witnessed in working with tutors, in working with students, generally there's too much correction that goes on. So there's a couple of things that we should keep in mind when it comes to correcting mistakes, and I'll get into those later as well. Okay, so in terms of setting communication goals, there are two types of main goals that I see. One of them is what I call macro goal, and the other one is a micro goal. So what is a macro goal? A macro communication goal is a situational communication goal. So generally something like this: I want to be able to, is one of the best ways of kind of putting this together and nailing it down. I want to be able to talk about my daily routines. That would be a macro situational communication goal, right? You could also say, I want to be able to talk about my family. I want to be able to talk about the weather. Okay, so these are all situations that we might have. A micro communication goal is more the lexical aspect. So it's the vocabulary that I need to achieve my macro communication goal. So in order to be able to talk about my daily routine, I need to be able to answer questions 1, 2, and 3. So for example, if I want to talk about my daily routine, I need to be able to talk about when I usually wake up, right? So this might be a specific question that will help me to move towards that macro goal of being able to talk about my daily routines. Okay, so as I said already, my tip, my recommendation in this case would be to practice speaking scripts. What is the way that students normally would approach this problem? Well, they'd learn some grammar, learn some vocabulary, and then they would try to have a conversation, right? And tutors are not doing this to torture them, but using scripts, which really is just it could be a dialogue, but it could obviously also be a story, something like that. Essentially, it's memorizing a text in advance and then practicing it with a tutor. The reason why this is better, one of the main reasons, is because you can really promote fluency. You can really work on your fluency because you don't have to think about vocabulary and think about pronunciation as long as you've prepared beforehand. And especially you reduce what's called cognitive load. And cognitive load is just the difficulty of any particular activity that you're doing right now. If the cognitive load is too high, so the thinking that is necessary, then I'm going to have a lot of difficulty doing whatever it is. If I can reduce that cognitive load, and for all of you interpreters out there, I'm sure you've heard this term before, then it's going to be a lot easier, right? And different language combinations have different levels of cognitive load. Okay, so what is the benefit of using scripts? And I'll show you guys an example of a script in a moment. That once again, you reduce the cognitive load, but that also gives you increased speaking confidence, right? Because you know exactly what you're going to be working on. And that way you can work on vocabulary, you can work on pronunciation, you can work on fluency, intonation, all of these aspects in advance. And you're also guaranteed to be using new vocabulary. When we speak freely, we tend to revert to whatever the easiest thing is. We tend to only use what I call our plateau vocabulary. So it's vocabulary that we're already familiar with, right? So you might think of a learner who's learning Spanish. You've all seen this before, you've done it as well. And they want to say something like, I am learning Spanish. So they have to think about every single word. Estoy aprendiendo, right? This fighting for words. Not only is it very, very frustrating, but it also is in no way really practicing fluency, right? Because I have to think about every single aspect of what I'm doing. Okay, so this would be an example of a simple script that you might work on with your tutor. And this is on the topic of daily routines. So the first question would be, what time do you usually wake up? I usually wake up at 8 a.m. Do you have a busy schedule? Yes, I'm busy during the week, but I don't work on the weekends. And where do you like to go when you have free time? When I have time, I like to go for a walk in the park near my house. Now, this seems like it's very simple, but for a beginner, it's going to be challenging, right, to memorize this. And it's also going to provide me with a lot of benefit because there's lots of really great vocabulary and grammatical structures here that I'm going to be able to benefit from later. And I'm going to benefit from them more if I memorize them, and then I can switch out words rather than trying to memorize some rule, which is not going to help me in a conversational setting anyway. Okay, so the idea here is that the tutor's posing the questions and the learner answers them. And our goal is always going to be able to understand questions immediately and fluently respond. Okay, so how do we write a script? How do we come up with a script? Well, if I have a conversation, if I have the macro goal of being able to talk about my daily routines, then obviously I want to come up with various questions like I just showed you, right? Those simple questions. And there's two ways I can do this. This is about my life, right? So it's automatically relevant and interesting to me, as opposed to something that I get from some book. That's another benefit of scripts, is that you can tailor them to your particular situation. There's two ways I can do this. I could write it in the target language. So if I'm learning Spanish, I can try to write it in Spanish. But if I'm a beginner, that doesn't really make any sense. I can still try to do it. I'll get some practice writing, and then my tutor can correct it. But if my focus is on speaking, it's probably just going to be a waste of time. So the second option makes a lot more sense. This is what I teach my students how to do. Write the script in your native language. So if you're a native speaker of Portuguese, write it in Portuguese, and then just translate it and give it to your tutor, right? And your tutor is going to be able to help you to correct that. And it's going to go a heck of a lot faster than it would if you had done it the other way around. You're also much more likely to write and later to speak the way that you would actually speak in your daily life, as opposed to when you write it in the target language. Especially as a beginner, you're only going to use the simplest language, and that's not our goal, right? Our goal is to be able to speak in the target language reasonably similarly to how we would speak in our native language, right? Okay, so then how would you practice? Well, rather than, as I said, talking about grammar and any number of other things with your tutor, utilize the class time you could utilize, for example, half of the class time practicing this, and then have your tutor actually record the script for you. So they're going to record the question for you, then leave a pause, and then record the answer. You can then take those recordings, you can go home, and you can practice with them. This is called stimulus and response. So what we want is we want our brain to be able to automatically respond to that stimulus. The stimulus is the question, and the response is the answer, obviously. If you can practice these on a daily basis, then eventually you will do them automatically. You won't have to think about it. You won't have to think about the vocabulary, you won't have to think about pronunciation, and you won't have to think about the grammar. And then when you go to class, then you actually practice making that seem like a real conversation, okay? And what you should encourage your tutor to do is obviously help you with the pronunciation, but without the expectation that it'll be perfect initially, right? There's always going to be room for improvement. Okay, if you have difficulty memorizing, or rather remembering the answers, one thing that you can do is you can use part of my translation cube learning method, which is called active reverse translation. So we have this question, what time do you usually wake up? And the answer here is I usually wake up at 8 a.m. So let's assume that I'm having difficulty remembering this answer. I usually wake up at 8 a.m. What I can do is I can translate every word of that response literally into my native language. So you can see in Portuguese, the first line here, it says, eu usualmente acordar. Now, why did I write para cima as one word with a hyphen? It's because in the answer, I usually wake up. Up is one word, right? In Portuguese, it's two words, para cima, right? Now, you don't necessarily have to agree with my translation. It's not for anybody else. So when you're doing these translations, you can do them however you like. All that matters is that the translation is supposed to help you to remember the grammar of the foreign language, and it's supposed to reduce cognitive load to help you to get back to that answer in your head, okay? Another thing you can do is give yourself the first letter of each word. So here you can see, I usually wake up at 8 a.m. In the second line below the Portuguese, it says I, and then you, W, U, and so on and so forth. So what you do is you cover up the answers in English, and then you use one or the other or both of these things to help you to remember after you listen to the question, the audio from your tutor, until you can do it quite fluently and quite automatically. And then you just take away the hints, you take away the literal translation or the first letter or both, until you can do it without looking at anything at all, okay? That's your goal. Okay, so just to be clear here, I'm not saying that speaking freely is not a good idea, right? And our goal with, what is fluency? There are different definitions, but generally people define fluency as being able to speak freely, speak off the cuff, as we say in English, about the topics that matter to you, right? And so this is our goal, and at some point we want to be able to do it. But what I'm saying is that I think, from my experience, not just as a teacher, but also as a learner, that speaking freely, especially for beginners, should make up a smaller percentage of what we do with our tutors, because what people generally focus on with tutors in class can generally be done outside of class, right? So you're kind of wasting that time that you have, that limited time that you have with that native speaker, okay? That doesn't mean, however, that advanced learners can't benefit from using scripts. They absolutely can, especially if you want to be able to speak in a more complicated way about more complex topics, okay? Regardless, you should always have the goal of using new vocabulary. So whether you're speaking freely or speaking using scripts, you should have a focus on, even if it's just one new vocabulary item, using new vocabulary. That's the biggest thing that's going to push your language growth, your language progress. Okay, so the initial question was, if you had one class per week, what would you do? And this is my answer. What should you do? In my opinion, what you should be focusing on is not wasting time fighting to express yourself because you're trying to speak too freely, especially if you're a beginner, right? Because that's just going to lead to frustration, and it's also going to lead to the formation of bad habits, because we're generally doing more outputting than we're doing getting input. But if we use recordings from our tutor, then we're going to be listening to that native speaker over and over again and practicing imitating the way that they talk, okay? And your goal, as I said, is always going to be able to immediately and fluently respond to the questions, stimulus and response. Eventually, and that's the cool thing about this, eventually, when we've memorized enough of these scripts, we'll be able to speak freely in a relatively relaxed way, because we have lots and lots of different chunks, lots and lots of different components that will allow us to do that, not just words, but also phrases, okay? Okay, so, and then the last thing, I talked about error correction before. One of the biggest things that you should let your tutor know when you first start working with them is that it's okay to not correct every error. And I've seen this, you know, we want to be able to help our students. We want to help them to reduce the number of errors that they make. But the question is correcting every error actually helping them as much as you think that it is? And the answer is generally no, especially if you're correcting everything they're saying. They never really get the opportunity to say anything, right? It's them speaking half the time and you correcting half the time, rather than them speaking 90% of the time and you correcting 10% of the time, or whatever it happens to be. So just a couple of rules of thumb here, simple ground rules. Correct me if you didn't understand what I said, and please correct me if I make the same mistake 3 times, right? Within one session. That is generally the rule that I follow. Otherwise, don't correct me, right? You can kind of go away from this rule on occasion, in special occasions, but by and large, this is a good rule of thumb to follow. Okay, looks like Juliana's very tired. He's got a lot to do though. Okay, so what have we learned about today? We have a limited amount of time with our tutors, so we need to have very, very clear goals. What do we want to do? Our communication goals. So we need to have macro communication goals, that is to say situational goals, and micro goals, that is to say lexical or vocab related goals. And then there's 2 different ways we can work on our speaking. One of them is the one that I recommend most of the time, which is working with scripts, because we reduce cognitive load, increase confidence, and give ourselves lots more opportunity to practice before we actually engage in speaking. And the other one is more free conversation, but even there, we should always be focusing on utilizing new vocab. And then the last thing that we said was encourage your tutor not to correct every mistake you make, because otherwise you'll never really be able to get a full sentence out, okay? Okay, so that's it on this topic from me today. If you are learning German and you are interested in my methods, then you can go to my Instagram page, which is LinguaThor Fluency, and just click on the link at the bottom of my profile. And then you'll find links to the 2 German classes that I offer. One is a German B2 masterclass, and the other one is a free German class that I offer with translations in English and Spanish. And I think there is some Portuguese on there as well, but I still have to kind of fill that out. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you all so much for your attention. I appreciate it. And ready for the question round.
Thank you so much, David. And you can stop sharing your screen, please.
Okay.
Juliano, eu tenho uma pergunta.
Yeah, could you ask it in English, Saleni, please?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yes. Hi,
Or
David.
if you could ask in Portuguese and Rafael would translate into English, but
Okay.
no problem.
I mean, I can
Okay.
usually understand the Portuguese questions.
But you could also
Yeah.
use the English channel here in the interpretation, but ask in English anyway.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Juliano. So, David, great talk.
Thank you.
Very sharp to the point. And I have the chance this year. I worked with the Cullen method. And
Mhm.
somehow this methodology you have developed is a little similar to that.
Mhm.
My impression is that one of the drawbacks, one of the flaws, it may be that it sort of doesn't feel natural when you're
Mhm.
just repeating the script with the
Mhm.
person. So my
Mhm.
question is there a time slot, and while you are tutoring someone, when you allow this, okay, teacher, I would like to say this, this, and this. I do not want you to say this format. You have this micro time slots where you can digress a little bit. Digress.
Digress,
You
yeah.
have, yeah, digress.
Digress,
Sorry.
yeah, yeah. Celine was your name, right? Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Selene, yeah, very well.
Selene. Okay, Selene. Thank you for your
Well
question. It's a
pronounced.
great question. I don't force my students or allow or not allow anything, but rather I give them recommendations based on my experience working with other students. So one of the first things that I do within the first couple of weeks of working with a student is create a game plan for their progress and see where they want to go. So establish, especially macro communication goals, right? What is it they want to be able to talk about? And then based on that, we decide how they would like to utilize the time in class. So I'm certainly not saying that I force students by any means to use this methodology and that no free conversation should take place. My biggest thing here is that for beginners, it's very, very difficult to engage in free conversation, right? For the reasons that I stated. So to answer your time frame question, I generally recommend that people memorize scripts for 2 to 3 months. So we're talking about memorizing now. It depends on obviously how fast they want to go, how long they want the scripts to be. At the beginning, it makes more sense to do shorter ones and focus on quality of pronunciation, obviously focusing on their abilities, even if they've prepared. When you actually pose the question to them, right, they don't necessarily understand, right? So it seems very easy on paper, but it's not, and that's why it's so beneficial. At the beginning, do less questions and answers, so shorter scripts, and then allow those to get longer, and then at some point, gradually start to inject more free speaking opportunities into the class. And as a tutor, I don't know whether you tutor as well, but as a tutor, you start to get a good idea of when somebody's going to be able to do that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there is a feeling somehow along the way we get the feeling that the person is ready. But I agree entirely. At the beginning, first initial 2, 3, 4 months is when you are consolidating the path.
Exactly.
You are building up the structure, so it has to be easier and a shortcut, a short way.
Exactly.
Thank you.
More controlled environment.
That's very much so.
Thank you, Selene, for your question.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to say that I liked very much when you describe the scripts, because that's what my Polish teacher Magdalena here does a lot with me, and she brings dialogues.
I saw that Magdalena is here.
We do a lot of that, and I like that because
Hi, Magdalena.
it gives me the impression that I am reading a text, I am fluent, and I can practice very easily.
Yes, and I love that you mentioned that, Giuliano, because that feeling of being fluent, although you're not necessarily fluent yet, is so important for your confidence, right?
Yeah. I feel very pleased when I understand the text completely, and then I can read it, and each one is one character of the dialogue, etc. Yeah,
and that's a big priority for me as well.
Any other questions from Zoom? Or maybe
Magdalena wanted to say something for a moment, but then she.
No, I just wanted to say, I mean, I think it's kind of difficult, but comes with experience, to know at what point to introduce the scripts and at what point to kind of stop them and at what point to introduce vocabulary. And also, okay, having a student like Giuliano is obviously making it easier because he hits, all the boxes that you mentioned at the beginning. So a highly motivated student, who knows how, who knows what he wants out of the classes. I think it's much more difficult to do with some of my students who are coming and go like, okay, teach me the language. You're like, okay, that's another pressure.
What does that mean?
So I think part of our job as tutors is to explain to the students what classes can look like if they put in some effort outside of the classes. And exactly as you say, like building that, training them through training them in those techniques is part of the deal.
So learning about learning, meta learning, exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah. Not everybody has the joy of having a student like Giuliano, who's a very experienced, right? Yeah.
Thank you so much. And we have here a question. Ivan, you can come here, please.
Here, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Hi, David.
Hi
How's it
there.
going?
What was your name? Good, thank you.
Yeah, my name is Ivan. Thank you so much
Ivan.
for your speech. That was nice. My question is that like every time I'm reading something, I feel like this is not just me. It's also for other people that I'm surrounded by. They say the same thing. Like when we're reading something and then we are kind of memorizing it, we feel the sense that we are even more fluent.
Yeah.
Then actually when you start and have a conversation, I mean, naturally. So is there an explanation? Is it something that is very common? I don't know if you got my point. Like
I think that I understand what you're.
let me explain an example. Like once I was in college, like back in the day. So I had a monologue to present of 10 minutes. And the teacher said, you guys have to write a story, memorize it, and present in front of the class. And we were not fluent yet. We were just the starters, you know, beginners. But then I created a story, I memorized it, and I was in front of the class, totally confident. But everything I was speaking, it was all by memory skills, you know? Then when I stopped and they're like, wow, he's fluent already. I said, can you guys repeat that again? So I would like to know, like, is there any explanation for this kind of phenomenon? Is this other people talk about this? Like when you read something and you memorize, you get the sense that you actually more fluent than what you actually are.
Now, the question is, why do you think that you're more fluent than you actually are?
Because I have everything memorized back in my mind, and even when I'm reading something, I can decide, okay, I'm gonna switch to another accent. Yeah, let's. So even we can even play some kind of game like, okay, switching accents, and you memorize it in a way that you feel free, and people look at you and wow, you're fluent already. It's no, I just memorized it.
My question to you is, what is the difference between being fluent in the sense that you're saying, where you can kind of freely talk about anything, and being fluent because you've memorized something, when the person you're talking to doesn't know the difference? That is to say, they don't know whether you're speaking freely or not. And if you think about it, and I wrote this in the presentation, but you know, I didn't specifically call anybody's attention to it. When we speak to each other on a daily basis in our native languages, we actually use scripts a lot, right? Our answers are very often very similar to similar questions. You don't really think about it, but we don't really say that many different things on a daily basis, right? And so I would say to you that there really is no difference between those two things. It's really just your feeling about it. So if you can memorize enough of these, and you let me just say, Ivan, that your pronunciation is very authentic sounding.
I do lots of I do lots of memorizations.
And I can tell. There you have it. Yeah,
I'm a living proof of it.
You are the living proof. Yes, incarnate. But I would say that there really is no difference. And working with students who actually take this to heart and spend more time people think about memorization as if it's a bad thing. It doesn't have to be a bad thing, as long as you're working with authentic input, right, from native speakers or from near native speakers, using things like songs, for example. I mean, I know people who've learned languages entirely from songs. I know a lot of you out there have learned, right, a lot from songs. So I don't think there's really a difference, to answer your question, right? As long as that your interlocutor, the person you're talking to, doesn't know the difference, there is no difference.
Yeah, but that was good. I mean, at least to open like a discussion, because we feel like we are another character or something, and then another identity. But this is true for everybody who speaks another language. You kind of have another character speaking that language, and so well, but that was okay. That was nice.
We have a lot of questions yet, so Magdalena.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan. Nice speaking to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on something that Ivan said, that that was about how he could, after a while, like also think about different accents and like leaning into different emotions maybe when speaking, or like saying something differently, because I don't know if anybody here is a little bit into acting, but that's essentially the Stanislavski method. So when you are learning a script, so if anybody feels like there's a great book, An Actor Prepares, that talks about it, and if you're learning a script, you are trying different ways of, you know, how you would feel about what you're saying, and you're learning that. And yeah, like that's what we do also in our native language, as David said. And in addition to learning from songs, it's great to shadow the things that people say in, say, TV series. And I know I went through a phase of, you know, watching Friends on loop, as many people have learned English through Friends. And I had a Monica phase where I would go like, I know, and just, you know.
Which sounds 100% American when you say it like that.
Yeah, that specific thing. And we actually had, I was working in a creche at one point, and there was a boy who was watching American cartoons, and he got like, he was speaking normally with an Irish accent. It was in Ireland, except when he was saying awesome, and I can't read that, but like he had this exact very American pronunciation of this word.
Yeah.
So we do that. Like, he was an Irish boy with English as his first language, but he was kind of learning, you know, repeating, and the scripts that he had heard in the TV series that he was watching. So we do that in our native languages too.
And that's the beautiful thing about working with scripts, is that you have the opportunity, because everything's in your head that you need, you can actually emote, as you said. You can actually perform, and you can work on things like accents, because if you have to think about every single word that you're saying because you're speaking too freely for your level, you're never going to be able to work on your performance. It's always just going to be, I'm fighting to string a sentence together. So that's a very, very good point, Magdalena. Absolutely.
Okay, Matt is saying in the chat that he would like to thank for sharing your point with us, David. And we have a question from here, and then go to Saleni again, please.
I'm gonna take my notebook because I'm gonna take notes of the answer. Hello.
Hello.
I have a question. This, like, first of all, the presentation was great. I am actually starting a Welsh course like next month, like on October 2nd. And I was really excited to hear all of the tips, because I'm gonna have only one class per week with my tutor. And it was like, when I asked, what would you do? I'm like, what would I do? That's what I'm going to do. I only have one class per week. So all of these tips were like they were great.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, as a self-taught learner, I remember my process of starting to learn French. I would watch movies, and there's a movie that I particularly like, which is Raw. And I remember going online and looking for the movie script, and I would either write some parts down, and then eventually I printed the whole thing out, and I would like watch the movie and be like reading what was happening. And when scripts were the thing that were being talked about, I was like, oh, is he going to talk about movie scripts? No, it was another kind of script. But I wanted to know, do you think that, like, without a tutor, using movie scripts as our scripts, do you think there is any, I mean, I believe that there is benefit to that, but do you have any tips that could enhance this experience, since we're not going to get like direct feedback on what we're doing? It's most like focusing on pronunciation, since we're going to have the input of like the native speakers talking, but we are not going to be able to have like translations. Like, what are your tips to enhance the experience of using movie scripts as our scripts?
So you said that there are no translations for the movie scripts. Now, couldn't you create those yourself? If you have the movie script in digital format, or you have some way to digitize the movie script, if you give it, it's given to you in a printed out form, then you can just use a scanner. I mean, these days you can use any phone to scan texts in, and then I would just chuck those texts into DeepL. It's English. No, you said Welsh. I'm sorry, right? Welsh.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you're going to need to use Google Translate, which granted is not as good as DeepL. In some cases, Google Translate is actually better than DeepL. In any case, Welsh, it's just not available. So you're going to have to use Google Translate, but generally the translations are good enough that you absolutely understand the gist or more, right?
Right.
So these days it's between 90 and 95% for most language combinations. And I know that because I work with hundreds of students with hundreds of different combinations. So one of the ways to check, by the way, is by taking the Welsh, translating it into English or Portuguese, what am I saying? You You don't actually need to do that in that case. I was thinking the other way around. Generally, it'll be obvious right away whether the translation is good, because if it makes sense, then it's probably good enough. Okay. And then what I would, if you're not going to have feedback from your teachers that what you're saying, the class is too large, so they're not going to be able to give you one-on-one feedback.
Yes.
Okay. Well, regardless, I mean, what feedback do you need besides what you have in audio form from the movie itself, right? So as long as you have access to that, then you can practice repeating the scripts, working your pronunciation, and then listen. You could record yourself if you wanted to, and then you could compare your pronunciation to the pronunciation of the native speaker in the movie. Right? Now, does that mean you'll necessarily be able to do it exactly like them? Because if you can't really hear the difference, then it's going to make it difficult for you. But would you necessarily be able to do that with your tutor is the question, right? Yeah. So what I would do is I'd do that to the extent possible for you, right? Compare your pronunciation with that of the native speaker in the film. And then eventually you can work with a one-on-one tutor, right? If you really get into it. And then you can kind of work, as we say, work out the kinks. That is to say, you can eliminate the kind of small errors. But if you do enough of this kind of comparative listening, as I like to call it, then your pronunciation is going to be pretty good.
Okay. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Yeah.
I think Seleni wants to say something. Seleni, please.
Yes, one final point. I'm going to share something I did when I started. That was far back in time, but we used to have just books, and there would be a narrative, a short story, and then we would discuss the grammar and details on the short story. So what I did while I was going back home, walking back home, after leaving class, I would try to use the structure and use the vocabulary of what was going on around me, the environment. Say I was crossing the street, so I would try to use what I was feeling or what I was thinking at that time and make it in English. And there was a struggle. There was a struggle because it was always something that was not prepared before. There were no scripts for that.
Precisely.
But my question is, you speak German and English and some Spanish, right? Do you feel that when you are using another language, do you sort of incorporate a different persona, a different performance style? Do you feel that this happens? Because mentally we're trying to go and find on permanent narrow path that were established while we were memorizing those scripts. Do you feel that?
Absolutely. In fact, for me, that's a process that happens now rather automatically, but that's because I worked on it. So as opposed to many learners who unfortunately learn primarily with texts, or if they do listening, it's only ever, it's not enough. Let's put it that way. It's probably not even 1 hour per week. But if you're working with audio, and especially if you're working with video, then you can actually, given that you don't live in the country and you have the opportunity to interact in real life with real people, then you can actually soak up all of the emotion, right, in the face. But it's not just emotion, it's not just body language, but it's also tone of voice, right? Your tone of voice in Spanish, for example, the quality of the voice tends to be more nasal. Now, there's variation depending on the dialect of Spanish that you're speaking, but there is a distinct nasal quality that does not exist in other languages, right? The same thing goes for a number of Asian languages. So if you don't pick up on those things and try to emulate them, then you're never going to sound authentic. And so I do think that that's incredibly important. And what you were talking about, describing things, walking around, you could do the same thing with a script, right? You could just say, okay, I know I have a 30-minute walk home today. I want to be able to talk about these things. You create a script, you work on it, and then you just work on that when you're doing your walk on your way home, right? So there's an infinite number of ways that you can use this, but to kind of answer your question in a succinct way, when I speak a different language, I am a different person automatically. I try to take on as much as possible of the mannerisms and tone of voice, all of those things, because I want to sound authentic. I don't sound perfect, but I want to sound more authentic. That's just me.
Hey, David.
Thank you.
In the beginning of your presentation, you said that there are many resources online and videos explaining grammar, and that you should not ask your tutor to explain those things because you can find them somewhere else yourself, right? And but for example, some people, as in my case, I preferred someone who gives me the answer very quickly than to spend, I don't know, 1 hour or 2 hours finding the
Oh,
answer.
sure. Yeah.
You know, I thought that when you were explaining that part.
No, you're absolutely right. I was talking about those cases, and this is usually quite obvious, where a student just has put no effort at all into, you could just type simple past versus present perfect video into Google and I can get an explanation. But you're absolutely right. If you can't find the answer, then you should absolutely ask your tutor, right? But a modicum of effort, a minimum of effort, goes a long way in terms of saving time, which you could use, as I said, much better with your tutor. Because if you have the option, why would you use that time with your tutor? Unless in your case, it's your preference, and that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with it. I just give recommendations.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, do you have more questions from here, please?
I can take one more question, then I've got to go.
One more question. Okay, last one.
Yeah.
Hello, David.
Hi there.
So, imagine the situation: you have a student with a very high English. This student doesn't have like a lot of problems in pronunciation, but you still see an accent there. And the student wants to sound more professional, so he wants to work on accent reduction, for example. Do you have like specific techniques to work on accent reduction, and you do it in your classes?
Yes, absolutely. So the most important, thank you for your question. The most important thing when it comes to accent reduction is, you need to have enough input to be able to know what output should sound like. But beyond that, you need to look at this problem as one of interference reduction. So most of the time when you have an accent, it's because your native language is interfering with the foreign language. That is to say, all that an accent is, all that accent means, is you're speaking a language with the sounds of another language. So you need to identify what the typical sounds are of your language and what the typical habits are, both phonetic and phonological, and then you need to work on reducing those. Now, I worked with a student recently, and she's Russian, she's learning German, and she was having difficulty. And I said, think about it this way: don't try to sound more German, try to sound less Russian, right? Which is the same thing, but it made a difference, right? So sometimes it's how you think about the problem, how you approach the problem, okay? So one thing that Portuguese speakers do, for example, is they tend to turn L's into U's, because that's what you do in Portuguese, right? Brazil, right? You don't say Brazil, but it's Brazil, right? So that tends to carry over into English, and then it becomes very, very typical of speakers of Portuguese, particularly Brazilian Portuguese, right? So if you know, first you need to know it, and then you need to work on eliminating it, and then you need to do it automatically. The last thing I'll say is there's 4 stages to the mastery of anything, okay? The first stage is unconscious lack of knowledge. That means you don't know what you're doing wrong. You're doing something wrong, you don't know something, and you don't know that you don't know it, okay? Unconscious. Then you have conscious lack of knowledge or conscious lack of ability. So you're still making the mistake, but you're aware. Then you have conscious ability. So you can do the thing correctly, but you have to think about it. And the final stage is unconscious ability. So you're doing it correctly and you don't have to think about it. Those are the 4 stages, and you can't skip any of them. You always have to go through them. So if you think about your language skills that way, then you can always, then you won't get frustrated because you know, okay, I gotta go through this, right? And then you just need to put in the time and the effort and have a system. Okay?
Okay, thank you so much, David.
My pleasure. My pleasure. All right. Thank you all. Thank you, Giuliano, and thank you once again to the entire team as well as to the interpreters. I really appreciate your efforts.
Okay, see you soon. Bye.
Okay, take care, everyone. Bye, Magdalena. Bye, Celine. Okay, bye-bye.